So parking, most people only want to talk about it or complain about it when they don't think there's enough, but really our cities suffer when we have too much parking. Unfortunately, most people don't want to advocate for less parking, but I was willing to, and when I started talking about it, other advocates and even elected officials started talking with me. So let's start from the beginning. Back in the 50s, we had car ownership booming, we had cheap gas, we didn't know about climate change, so we built a bunch of houses on the outskirts of the city, and we started building freeways to inject cars into the city with their occupants. And then we tore down housing and offices in those cities to build parking lots to store the cars when people weren't driving them, which is most of the time. Planners and elected officials made ratios and requirements for amounts of parking for certain land uses, and people became very accustomed to free and easy parking everywhere they went. And it pretty soon seemed common sense to have parking lots that took up many times the space of the building that they were serving, and to have more parking space in buildings than housing space, for example. In the 70s, a professor from UCLA, Don Shoup, started studying the effects of these ratios on cities and found out that they weren't really good. They induced traffic, which caused pollution. They made cities less walkable, led to suburban form, and they really made building affordable housing in cities difficult, which is a problem that plagues us to this very day. Shoup proposed that cities should get out of the business of setting precise ratios and instead eliminate the requirements and use market and performance-based targets to lead to efficient use of parking. Take the revenue from that parking revenue and spend it in the localities where it's collected to increase public services and maybe even subsidize transit. This is a good policy, and not a lot of policies can affect multiple things simultaneously that we like, but parking policy can make a better environment, can make for a more walkable environment, cut down on traffic and traffic incidents, and most importantly, when you don't have to spend $50,000 per unit on parking underground, you can build a lot more parking in areas of opportunity, which is good. It helps us in our current housing crises. Fortunately, people don't like to talk about this honestly. People are used to cheap and free parking, and when the cheap and easy parking, and when they don't get it, they complain loudly. So elected officials move slowly, if at all, and usually enact half-assed measures that don't solve the problem or make people happy. We'll take Portland for an example. In 2002, Portland kind of got ahead of the curve and eliminated minimum parking requirements for a lot of housing on transit corridors, but we didn't create any parking management tools for neighborhoods to use if that was built. So in 2011, when we started seeing a lot of buildings without parking get built, people got really mad and complained. City Hall started listening to those people, but they didn't have any tools really available. We have an area permit program that costs $5 a month. It sells unlimited permits, so people were pretty irritated with having to buy a hunting permit for a problem that they didn't feel they caused. And just as the housing crisis nationwide, and particularly in Portland, was getting underway, City Council took a step back and instituted new minimum requirements that made it harder to build housing everywhere. Now, a lot of people knew what the right thing to do was here, some officials and planners, but there was no one really to help them create space for it. Who would be willing to step out on this issue? But I did. So I formed a group called Portland Shoupistas, and it was a club basically, and I started a blog and a website, and we started having educational events and social events, and people actually started coming to them. I connected with transportation advocates, tenants' rights advocates, environmental advocates, and when we talked about this issue, as I pointed out on the previous slide, we talked about how this issue can impact all of these issues, and they bought in. So last year, here in Northwest Portland, the city was talking about instituting new minimum requirements for housing because there weren't any here. And we had a coalition ready and some advocates ready to testify against this. I looked into that. We presented some evidence that the 2013 requirements had really suppressed the amount of housing being built in the city, and we organized a lot of testimony about that and went to City Hall and the Planning Commission, and we won. City Council didn't implement these requirements. And this was a turning point in Portland's parking discussion. And until now, I was usually the only person in the comments at Bike Portland or Reddit saying, hey, we should not build more parking, and now there were other people doing it too. So really, we started to gain some momentum, and the policies that we were promoting started to gain some traction as well. Back here again in Northwest Portland, after we shut down their ability to push the cost of parking onto new residents, they realized they would have to do something about the parking they had already. So they're looking at tripling their parking rate to $15 a month, still really low, but they're going to use that money to subsidize transit and bike town for people who don't get parking permits in the area, which is how it's supposed to work. You make it cheaper for people who don't want to drive. Emboldened by this, as the comp plan was wrapping up, we decided to go on the offensive and formed a campaign to tell City Council to trade parking for more affordable housing. We heard that the mayor was interested in rolling back those 2013 requirements, so we reached out to the same coalition, largely tenants' rights activists and other groups, and started submitting testimony to the comprehensive plan early implementation phase. We ended up submitting 80 letters, which is 10% of the total testimony, asking to remove parking requirements. And on November 22nd, City Council passed an amendment that effectively waived parking requirements for buildings with affordable housing. And a month later, they required affordable housing in all qualifying buildings. So we won, basically, there. This policy is going to hopefully work. In Selwood, there's a developer who has permitted 187 units with 46 required parking spaces. He's interested in refiling under inclusionary zoning to build 210 total units with 40 affordable units for 60 to 80% MFI. This is a 2-for-1 switch parking to housing, like many graphics show. It's textbook. And a couple weeks ago, in front of one of the most pro-car, anti-density neighborhoods in the city, the mayor said the debate over parking in Portland and housing is over, housing has won. So by creating a messaging and a group that was willing to stand out on this, we created room for planners and officials to make the right choices and defensively make them. We have a lot of work to do still. We don't have a permit program still for neighborhoods, so I'm expecting a backlash for inclusionary housing soon. Most of our streets are not permitted, and where they are, they're cheap. And PDC is trying to build parking garages in the central city instead of spending that money on transit or housing. But we're headed in the right direction. So basically, when you're looking at an issue that people think is maybe boring or you can't make traction on, I say ignore that. Start talking about it. Organize. If you need to bribe your friends to show up at City Hall to testify by buying them burritos, do that. We can make a better future. Thanks. My name is Tony Jordan, Portlanders for Parking Reform.